today. Great to have the weather keep and to have such a full house of people. I've forgotten what it looks like to be on stage with people. So welcome, welcome, welcome. I know that the acknowledgement of country is already being done, but I too, and I speak for Garry too, would like to pay my respects to the elders past and present being here on Darkinjung country. So, The Devil's Work. Now this is a book that is really up my alley. Thank you, Jackie, for the lovely introduction. I'm also a board member of the Bad Sydney Crime Writers Festival. I co-present a Bad All About Crime podcast. So this combination of extraordinary research and extraordinary happenings in the past really has me interested. So I'm particularly thrilled to be here with Garry Linnell to talk to him about Frederick Deeming, a violent man who might just have been Jack the Ripper. Before we start though, Garry, I think you might be local. Geelong boy turned local here.
You might have Beach. Yeah, been up here. I've been on the Central Coast for 7 or 8 years now, I think.
Do you think it's still a bit of a hidden treasure, or do you think it's becoming more and more known?
I think it's been uncovered now, and I think the pandemic has sort of opened that right up. I think we're seeing a lot more people now discovering what a great place it is to live. And that's obviously clearly pushed up prices everywhere and starting to change, I think, the whole nature of it. But it's one of the great wonders, I think, of the world. And that's why we live here, we just love it.
And I think in the various hamlets it still retains a village feeling, but with a really strong cultural input. It seems that the bookshop has a really vibrant community, and each time I've been up here for literary events, there's been a really dynamic crowd.
Yeah, I'm getting to the stage now when I had to go down to Sydney yesterday afternoon, and the knuckles on my hand around the steering wheel when you go off, take that left turn and get onto the Pacific Highway, and there are people screaming at you and putting their fingers up, and you just go, I don't need to see any more in my life. Let me go back to the coast.
I'm wondering though why then you would focus on someone as awful as this Frederick Deeming.
You're going to love a character like that. I was working on a separate project last year and had something to do with Alfred Deakin, our second Prime Minister. And I was reading Deakin's diaries in the National Library of Australia. And he mentioned that he'd taken over the case of Frederick Deeming. And I hadn't been aware of this before. It happened back in 1892. I'll just give you a very quick potted sort of history. Frederick Bailey Deeming, he was born in the Merseyside in England. Very eccentric character. Murdered his, I won't sort of hold back the secret of the book, murdered his first wife and 4 children. Buried them under a concrete slab in a small rented house in a village called Rainhill in the UK. He was a serial conman, swindler and bigamist. He was addicted to women and he kept marrying them. And one of the questions you'd have to ask yourself is why? Because he was a horrible kind of human being. But not only that, he was haunted by the ghost of his dead mother. And there are lots of different themes that weave their way through this book. But the reason that I was attracted to it is because Alfred Deakin started talking about him and how he'd taken on his case. Because after killing his first wife and 4 children, he then married another young woman in that village and brought her out to Australia. And they settled in Melbourne. And within 2 weeks, he killed her and buried her body underneath the hearthstone of a fireplace in a bedroom in a rented home in Melbourne. And he then took off and within days was proposing to another young woman on the boat to Sydney, who was she became the uncemented bride because she got away with it. But 3 months after he killed the second wife, there was a peculiar smell coming out of this bedroom, and the owner of the house was trying to rent it out. And there was a recession on in Sydney and in Melbourne at that stage. And he was really struggling, and eventually they prized open the brickwork and found her body in there. And that led to a nationwide manhunt for Frederick Deeming, and they eventually found him in the small mining town of Southern Cross in Western Australia, in the middle of nowhere, arrested him and brought him back. And it's hard for us now to imagine what it was like because there was no social media back then, and the telegraph was this newfangled invention that was suddenly opening up the world to everyone. But after this nationwide manhunt, people were fixated by it. When he arrived back in Melbourne under police guard, they took him off the boat. There were 8,000 people gathered at the pier to see him. They followed the horse and carriage that took him into the city to the lockup. When the trial took place over 4 days at the Supreme Court in Melbourne, there were up to 20,000 people lining the streets every morning as the carriage came through. And it was in May and it was brutally cold, and well, we can't talk about it up here, but typical Melbourne weather back then. And they actually had a ticketing system for the court case, so you could queue up and get a ticket so you could actually get in. It was a huge event. And it was actually covered on the front page of the New York Times, the trial, every day. They had their own correspondent out here. And this is when I really started falling in love with the story because, you know, I had a great story. I had a future Prime Minister of Australia defending Deeming in court. Deeming himself was haunted, or claimed to be haunted by the ghost of his dead mother, who said that she came to him every morning at 2 o'clock, wanting him to kill the woman that he was with, and that he sort of fought off these urges, but he couldn't help himself. And Alfred Deakin was a spiritualist himself. He'd been to a Sunday school spiritualism teacher. He married the daughter of one of the biggest spiritualists in Melbourne. When he was 16, Deakin believed that he could summon other people from a separate room and control their thoughts using his telepathic powers. So this is something we don't often talk about our Prime Ministers, do we? But he's not that odd, let me tell you, compared to some of the ones that we've had over the years. So you had him, but you also had, sitting in the gallery, was this journalist from the New York Times. Sidney Dickinson was his name. And he came from a very moneyed family back in New England, in Boston. And he came out here, and he was attracted to the case because it was big news all around the world. But also, he was a spiritualist, and his wife was a medium. And so spiritualism had really taken off. You know, it's begun up in New York State in the late 1840s when 2 young girls, the Fox sisters, decided to play a trick on their mother by either learning how to use their knuckles, and they could actually do it with their toes as well, by flicking them back and forth. They could make a cracking sound. They also learned that if you put an apple on a string and hit it behind your bed, you could let it drop and you could hear mysterious thumps in the night. And it was a joke and a prank that got out of hand because suddenly you had journalists arriving in this small little village in New York, and by the 1850s and the 1860s, the literati and the intelligentsia of New York and elsewhere across America were completely besotted with spiritualism. And this was at a time, don't forget, when Charles Darwin's theories of evolution are only just taking place. There's this great sort of battle going on in the second industrial revolution, really, where you've got the telegraph coming through, the phonograph. Edison is experimenting, trying to find a filament that will produce the long-lasting white globe that is just going to completely light up the world and transform our lives. He's even plucked a hair from someone's beard to test if it would act as a great filament in that light bulb. You've got Carl Benz tinkering away with a 2-stroke engine that's going to set the scene for the first motor car. You've got Alexander Graham Bell up there in Canada mucking around in on his farmhouse with something that's going to transmit the human voice. So you've got this incredible, what we've been living through over the last 20 years, this incredible revolution, and upended the normal way of life. And people have begun questioning the Bible and particularly the Old Testament and what it was teaching. And in spiritualism, along came this new idea that there was an afterlife, that you could communicate with those people that you had lost. And as it grew, so too did the business of being a spirit medium. And you had Queen Victoria, who lost her husband in the 1870s, who was suddenly incredibly relieved to know that she could still talk to him through a spirit medium. So you had all of these things happening, and Sidney Dickinson, the American journalist who's arrived in Australia, his wife is completely besotted by spiritualism. She believes that she can see ghosts and spirits in the afterlife. You've got Alfred Deeming, who also believes that. And you've got Frederick Deeming, who's saying that the only reason he killed 2 women and 4 children, and possibly more, we'll get to Jack the Ripper in a minute, but he's saying it's only because the spirit of his dead mother was whispering in his ear at 2 o'clock every morning. So, that's why I decided this is such a great book. I've got to actually tell it.
You know, sometimes when you get told a story, it tells you a lot about the person being interviewed as well. The enthusiasm with which Garry has given this story just shows me just how much journalism must have bitten you. I mean, this excitement at the world around you and the world around Frederick Deeming, is this what made you get into journalism, this excitement?
Yeah, I mean, when I was 12 years old, I think I saw All the President's Men, the movie first, before I actually read the book. And Woodward and Bernstein, I mean, they were the inspiration for a generation of journos. And I thought, what a great life that must be. And I sort of lucked into it. I managed to get a cadetship at the age, I think I was the token working class kid that year, back in 1982. And they sent me around the world, and I was lucky enough to, go everywhere and covered sporting events and political events and big news. And it's one of those jobs where you just get up every day, and no matter how tired you might be, you go, what's going to happen today? No day is ever the same. And it was the same when I was editing. And I've edited everywhere. I edited the Bulletin magazine, so kind of half highbrow, half in between, depending what your views were on that magazine. It's now extinct. The Daily Telegraph, I don't know what most of you think about that. It's such a great place to work, and to work in that environment where the pressure is incredibly intense at the Age and looking after Fairfax's mastheads and at Channel 9, it's never like dull. And there are days when you're really miserable and things go awfully wrong and someone drags you into court and you're trying to protect something else, but overall, and I've had absolutely no regrets, and I think I've taken that approach to books as well. I mean, I just get excited about stories and then trying to tell them, because Frederick Deeming is a really fascinating character, but frankly, who wants to read 300 pages about a murderer unless there's someone else in that book that you can identify with? Because I always said to the reporters who worked with me, I don't care how much information you've got, you've also got to make people feel something. That visceral sense when you actually read a great sentence or a great paragraph that lifts you up, that's what you've got to get across in your stories. And I didn't have that with Deeming at the start, because I just had a cold-blooded madman, and I actually wanted to feel something for one of the characters in the book. And then I stumbled across Sidney Dickinson, the American journalist, who wrote this incredible book. It was published posthumously, but he wrote about his encounters with Frederick Deeming, and these ghosts that were inhabiting the house that he was also renting in Melbourne. He and his wife had moved into a rented house. They began, his wife, he said he was never blessed with the ability to see these spirits like us, but his wife could see them, and she'd point out the creepy little girl sitting there in the corner sucking her thumb and singing little songs to herself. There's always a theme, isn't there, with ghost stories? There's always a creepy little girl in a nice white dress. Think of The Shining with those twin girls standing there as a river of blood comes towards you. And I was attracted to it because this was a man who had lost his first wife giving birth to his only daughter. And I think he was probably a very vulnerable guy. His career had gone downhill as a journalist in America until he became an art professor. And he was touring the world with what was called a stereoopticon, which was this magnificent bit of technology in the 1870s and 80s, which was the forerunner of motion pictures. So it was a projector with 2 lenses. So it would actually project one image on the wall and then dissolve that slowly and replace it with another one. And the technology had improved by the 1880s because it was now in colour. You could get them colorised over in Paris and then tour the world. So he was touring the world, and he arrived in Australia doing that, and then became consumed with the story of Frederick Deeming. And I needed him as a counterpoint to Deeming. So you're always looking for those sort of, I think, characters when you're writing. I mean, you know that too in your novels. You you're looking for someone to be able to tell the story through that the reader will also kind of want to and be a little bit of a guide for you.
I think you're also underplaying yourself a bit in that, because I think as well as a plot and a person by which to tell it, you need a voice. You need a really powerful voice. And I think particularly as we open the Devil's Work, that voice comes through. I'm hoping you might read a bit from the Devil's Work to show us what I mean by that.
I hate reading my own stuff. Once I've written something, I tend not even to go back to it again. You know, when you're writing it, you keep rereading it. And I think it's because of that you write 100,000 words and you probably essentially read the equivalent of 2 million words because you're just reading it time and time again. But once it's published, I go, no, next one.
We were talking about politics beforehand and how so much of politics can be a performance. I'm wondering, can this be a bit of a performance today?
I'll do my best. I'll do my best. This is chapter 2. So I've actually already introduced Sydney Dickinson, the American journalist, but this is about Frederick Deeming. The doomed man stood in his death cell in the Melbourne jail. He was alone except for a bucket, a small flimsy cot, and his dead mother crouching in a corner. As usual, she was screeching at him, telling him he was worthless, that he would be dead before he turned 40. Frederick Deeming had heard it all before. The old hag never had anything new to say. She was always spitting the same gobfuls of hate and spite. You would think he would have been used to the death and decay on her breath and all those horrible insults she hurled his way. You would think he could have summoned one of his well-known callous sneers and made her cower and shake with fear too. But he cringed every time. Mother's voice never lost its sting. She knew her boy too well. She didn't need a belt to make him cry and beg her to leave him be. This son of hers disgusted her. He was an abomination, the spawn of the devil himself, a twisted evil thing she should never have pushed from her womb. Mother had always been right, and the entire world agreed with her. Hadn't everyone known little Freddie wouldn't amount to much? He had spent most of his life trying to prove them wrong, to show them Frederick Bailey Deeming was not a man to underestimate. Hadn't he escaped from that dull Merseyside life as soon as he could? Please, Mother, give him some credit. He wasn't like the rest of them, back in Birkenhead, those unimaginative brothers of his, content to endure their miserable lives in the noise and filth of the Laird brothers' shipyard, who came home to endless rows of tiny houses where kids played on grimy streets, and every day was the same. Saw the world he had, sailed its oceans and crossed its continents. Was it any wonder that whenever he returned from one of his overseas odysseys, he couldn't help but boast about his achievements? Old Lancashire folk who stubbornly clung to the old words called it braggarting, and once Freddie got himself all wound up, he would find it hard to stop. If you disagreed with him, or far worse, ridiculed him, he'd start a decent fratching, a loud quarrel that would see him get so worked up, his voice would climb higher and become more frantic until it was almost a squeak. He had been a right strutter with his fancy clothes and diamond rings and awkward airs and graces. Sometimes he had hung a heavy gold watch from a chain attached to the breast pocket of an expensive frock coat. On other days, he replaced it with military medals he claimed to have won in torrid battles in foreign lands. He had scars to prove it too, and he wasn't shy when it came to showing them off. He would quickly roll up a trouser leg and show you the wound on his leg, or open his shirt to expose where an enemy's knife had slashed his chest. If he was really out to impress, there was always a small hole in the back of his head he was only too willing to allow the curious to examine. "Put your finger in there," he would say. "See how it fits?" Bullet did that. Big little man was Frederick Deeming. If he pulled himself up straight in a pair of well-heeled boots, he might have been described, somewhat generously, as being of average height, nothing more. But the way he swaggered, everyone agreed that for all of his strangeness, he was a cocky one. He was like one of those bantam roosters that dwelled in many of Birkenhead's tiny backyards, scrawny defensive things, scratching in the dirt below clotheslines sagging with stained overalls, always preening and fluffing their feathers to make themselves look bigger and more important. If he was conscious of his height, he would have you know it never stopped him from cleaving the heads of angry savages in deepest Africa, or entering a darkened cave and launching a battle to the death with the pride of ferocious lions. Every story bigger, every tale more outlandish, every lie more unbelievable. So many lies. The doctors who had examined him, the police who had interviewed him, and the priests who had tended to his soul no longer knew what to believe. He had told them all about his dead mother's abusive visits and how over the years she had woken him at night and urged him to kill. He had resisted for as long as he could, but Mother could be awfully persuasive when she was in the mood. But was Mother really there? Or was she just another of his many deceptions? The question had dominated his trial. Was the man genuinely insane? Or were his claims about his dead mother's murderous orders just another of his crude ploys, a way to feign madness in a bid to avoid the noose? If that was the case, you had to give him credit for keeping up the pretense, because Frederick Deeming had run out of chances. There would be no more appeals. In a few days, they would lead him to the gallows. He was 39 years old. He would be dead before he was 40. Bloody Mother, right again.
I don't know how many of you have read The Choke by Sophie Laguna. And it's about a little girl who grows up in a very difficult circumstance. And my understanding is that it was written, or the inspiration came from stories that Sophie had been told of a woman who later murdered a number of people, and trying to imagine where that comes from. With Frederick Deeming, we're introduced to a pretty damaged young boy. What was it about his childhood that sparked your interest?
Look, the background to his story is very sketchy, but we do know that he was born in about 1852. The family moved a lot. His father was a whitesmith, so as opposed to a blacksmith, tinkered with silver plates and smaller tin and metal objects. But he was also a very haunted man. He believed in ghosts. In one of the houses that they were living in, he thought that some of the previous occupants had been murdered, and he could actually hear their footsteps walking around. And his wife, I think, must have had a terrible existence with him. They ended up having 7 or 8 children, as you did back in the 19th century, because you tried to have as many kids as you could because of the high mortality rate. And Frederick's father took an instant disliking to him. By the time he was born, Frederick's father had left the family for a while, so the mother had to trip all over England looking for him and wanted to be taken back in again because there was no alternative for her. I suspect the mother was obviously beaten up a fair bit by the father. He'd go off into these murderous rages and then threaten to kill himself. So several times young Freddie and some of his brothers would have to grab Dad as he rushed out to the backyard with a scalpel in his hand, threatening to cut his throat. So this was one of the things he sort of endured as he was growing up. The brothers all ended up getting jobs in the Lead Brothers shipyard near Liverpool. That he began running away from home at the age of 13 and jumping on ships on the Mersey and heading out around the world. He disappeared for weeks on end. And he'd come back and tell all these fabulous stories of the life he lived. And he wanted a better life. He wanted to get out of that lower working class existence. But he didn't quite know how to do it, and he wasn't smart enough to pull it off. So he thought that you could actually disguise your upbringing by wearing long black frock coats and talking with a much more middle class accent, but he couldn't pull it off because he was a Lancashire boy. And he dropped his H's all the time. And there's a really telling episode where, having fleeced another woman, he married another woman, by the way, in the city of Hull, and he sensed that the cops were coming after him because he'd also fleeced a whole lot of people of £60,000 in an enormous sum back then in South Africa. And he had to get out. And he thought, I'll go to South America because that's a place with no extradition treaties. And so he left her high and dry, took off on his boat, and the boat carrying him to South America, he suddenly passed himself off as a diamond dealer, a very rich man. And he organised a sing-along on the deck one night and hand-delivered all of these beautifully drawn invitation cards to everyone. and he began singing a song. And it was called The Old Horse. And it's an old sea shanty that people tend to sing after you've completed your first navigation of the globe. It's a kind of a traditional sailor's song. The problem for him is he passed himself off as a high-end diamond dealer, but he kept dropping his H's as he sang the song. It was The Old Horse. You know, he got an and everything. And I can't do a Lancashire accent very well, so I wanted to try. And people began laughing and giggling, and he would have become aware of that. He would have seen that, and that would have humiliated him even more. He ended up being arrested once he got to South America, because, as usual, Freddie Deeming had really bad luck, and an extradition treaty had already just been signed. So he was finally taken back to England, jailed for 11 months for fleecing some jewellers there, and got out, and that's where he ended up leaving Hull, went to Rainhill, the small village, murdered his poor first wife, this woman who sort of had to put up with him for almost 20 years, and the 4 kids. And their bodies were later found beneath a series of concrete blocks, wrapped up, some of them in their pyjamas, his wife still wearing the wedding ring, and by then he was in Australia denying that he'd ever been there. But that's where the Jack the Ripper side of the story comes in, because in 1888, in the autumn of 1888 in London, in Whitechapel, there were at least 5 women, brutally murdered. And despite common belief, they weren't all street workers and sex workers and prostitutes. They were women who just had a hard life, and their marriages had broken up. Some of them were alcoholic. We all know about the Jack the Ripper mystery. It's the most enduring cold case in history. No one will ever solve it. I think there's good reason, and of course, naturally, I would say that because I've written the book, but I think there's good reason to put Deeming among the top 3 or 5 suspects. There's some circumstantial evidence. There's a woman, a young dressmaker, who went to one of the newspapers to say that she'd been courted by this man who fitted perfectly Deeming's description in that autumn. He was taking an incredible interest in the press coverage of the Jack the Ripper killings. He would ask her questions about that, saying, "You don't think I was capable of it, do you?" And then he would mysteriously disappear. His description fitted the description of one witness who claimed to have seen the Ripper leaving shortly after killing one of the women and dismembering her. But his modus operandi when he killed is very different to the Ripper. The Ripper liked to leave his victims exposed. And when you read the coronial reports about what he did, just horrendous stuff, dissection of bodies, the placing of body organs around the room. Deeming, when he killed his first wife and 4 children, just slashed their throats, strangled one of his daughters, and then was quick to bury them. He wanted them hidden. Same with his second wife, or third wife. At last count, he buried at least 4 women, all roughly at about the same time. But there probably were more.
So that seems to imply that it's not him. I mean, if you've got one modus operandi and then a completely different one, and also you've got strangers and your own family.
But it also depends on what we think about Frederick Deeming and what is his state of mind, and that's the most difficult thing to comprehend. Did he actually believe that he was really being haunted by his mother, or was that just another one of his scams that he used to pull people off? I mean, he maintained right to the end, the time that they put a rope around his neck and he was left dangling there in Melbourne jail, that he had been haunted by his mother and she had been ordering him to kill. And that was the basis of the insanity defence that Alfred Deakin argued in court. But arguing insanity in the 1890s in colonial Australia, waste of time. I mean, there was just this fundamental lack of understanding about the way that the human mind worked. A very popular notion at that time, there was an Italian anthropologist called Cesare Lombroso, and in the 1870s he began examining the skulls of dead people, and particularly criminals. And he came up with this view that there was an instinctive criminal. This was someone who had been born bad, basically. And not only that, but you could also tell by looking at how large their earlobes were or how many bumps in the back of their head they had. And we laugh now, but this kind of idea was still there in the 1930s and 40s. If we go on Trove, I suppose most of you would have seen Trove, the National Library's digitised archive of newspapers and magazines. It's one of the great treasures of this country, and it's free. Every other country in the world, apart from New Zealand, when you want to look at their digitised archives, you've got to pay. And pay through the nose, let me tell you. I've been subscribing to the UK newspaper archive for the last 2 years because I need it for books. It's hundreds and hundreds of dollars a year to get access. Here it's free. And here you can cross-reference it for these, so you can actually go back and have a look at all of the newspaper accounts. It's one of the most wonderful things to be able to go back and look at a newspaper in 1892 and read the letters to the editor and see what people were thinking about at that stage and what was moving them and what was making them angry. And it gives you a sense of the time and the place. And I found that quite an incredibly rich source of material for this book.
Other books you've written include Buckley's Chance and Moonlight. Tell me a bit about Moonlight.
Yeah, Moonlight that came out, you probably haven't seen it because it came out during one of the big lockdowns. But hopefully it's going to be appearing on Netflix or Stan in the next couple of years, the way things are going. Gay bushranger, and I was asked a lot when that book came out, do you think it was going? I was, well, not that it really matters, but I think definitely. And he was one of the most fascinating characters in our colonial history. Born into wealth in Northern Ireland, in a small village called Freeland. His father was a JP, very eminent man. They went to New Zealand, and he was another troubled individual, you might say, with issues that couldn't be solved by science and medicine of the day. He ended up in Australia, became a lay preacher for the Anglican Church, and was preaching around Ballarat and a small town called Egerton, which was during the gold rush, towards the end of the gold rush, and robbed the bank there of about £1,000. Took off, sold a boat to Fiji, bought an island using promissory notes that was later to be swindled a whole bunch of people over there. Sailed a yacht back into Sydney Harbour on Boxing Day through the biggest storm that Sydney had ever seen, and that's saying something. And was jailed for 2 years for fraud, and then came back to Melbourne and was arrested for the Egerton bank robbery. And he escaped from the Ballarat jail just before his trial. And he again became one of the biggest names in Australia for a certain period of time. People were besotted by him. Ended up taking a group of 4 young, naive, impressionable young men with him. They walked from Melbourne to Albury and ended up in Gundagai, where they laid siege to the Wagstaffe station, which was one of the biggest sheep stations and cattle stations in Australia at the time. And during the shootout, one of the police officers was killed there. They were arrested. And his best mate, James Nesbitt, was a young guy that he met in Pentridge prison. And they formed this incredible bond. You can go through the prison records and see that James Nesbitt was sentenced to 1 day in solitary confinement for taking prisoner Andrew George Scott, who was Moonlight, a cup of tea when he shouldn't have. They were incredibly close, and people sniggered. In the 1890s, there was a moment during the siege when the station manager sniggered at them and used the word poof, which back in the 1890s, P-O-U-F, which would later become poof, right? And so it was talked about back then, but in a very dense, very unclear way. You've got to read the letters in the letters to the editor sections of the newspapers to see what people are hinting at. The dark practices that go on in our prisons, they hint at and talk about it. Anyway, James Nesbitt was shot during that siege, and Moonlight cradled him in his arms, and as he died, kissed him passionately all over his face and was heartbroken. And from then on, he was then transported to Sydney. There was a huge trial, and he ended up being hanged on the 20th of January I forgot the date, 1880. And there were more than 5,000 people who gathered outside Darlinghurst Jail to try and get a glimpse over the walls of the rope and that moment when it took place. These were public spectacles in many areas until about the 1870s when they started becoming ticketed affairs. So if you were a journalist or you were a judge or a lawyer, you were found it easy to get access, and people enjoyed going along to executions. The most famous executioner in Australia's history was Nosey Bob, Robert Howard, who he was called Nosey Bob because he had no nose. He'd been a handsome cab driver in Sydney in the 1860s when a horse kicked him in the nose, and so he actually just had a hole here where his nose used to be. And so he became hangman because he couldn't get a job doing anything else. And he was regarded as essentially as a leper in society. If you went into a pub and had beer, the bartender would then smash that beer on the floor, the glass on the floor, so that no one else's lips would touch the same glass that had been drunk by Nosey Bob the hangman. And so that was another story where you just had all these incredibly rich characters who sort of all came together at a certain point. But Moonlight was a really fascinating bloke. He was incredibly smart and intelligent. He used to give public lectures in Victoria after he was let out of Petrie prison, where he talked about the need for reform in the prison system. And this is 1879, 1880. He was actually a man on many fronts who was well ahead of his time. And what I liked about him was the fact that he wasn't embarrassed by who he was. He openly declared his love, and the only reason we know about his love for James Nesbitt and his love for those young men who stood by him during the siege were these incredible letters that he wrote. And they weren't discovered until the 1990s by researchers. And you can go and read them now in the archives. You've got to drive a fair way out to have a look at them, and you've got to put on white gloves, but they'll bring them out for you, and they'll set up, they're on the blue prison paper that they used back in the 1880s, and he's got this beautiful handwriting. But during the last 8 weeks of his life, he was writing furiously every night by candle in his death cell. And you can tell by 2 a.m, the candle must have burned right down to its nub. And his handwriting then starts to drunkenly weave a little bit and slant across the page. So it's incredible, and the hair on your back, I don't have hair on the head, but on the back of the neck it stands up, because you're actually almost a touch away from the man himself when he was actually pressing his fountain pen on it. You can see the ink blotches and where he's actually had to smudge it. And that's, to me, there was nothing better than doing that, sort of trying to, and deciphering that beautiful handwriting too.
So Chicken and the Egg, was it the letters that inspired you to write about Moonlight, or were you inspired to write about Moonlight and the letters made it more exciting?
I think I was inspired by the story of Moonlight because I don't think his story had been told particularly that well in the past. And also he was a different kind of so-called bushranger. I'd grown up as a kid in the 60s and 70s in Australia, the bushranger almanac. And you'd flick through the pages and you could actually see these great photos. As a kid, 9 or 10 years old, you'd see a photo of what was his name, Mad Dan Kelly and the rest of them who were shot, Mad Dan Morgan, who killed 4 police officers. And when they killed him, they propped him up in a bed, in a cot, in a small pub in northern Victoria, and put matchsticks in his eyes to keep the eyelids open. So he's sitting there, dead as a doornail, smiling at the camera. These guys were celebrities back then. They were huge names, and not just in the newspapers, but I mean, if they were around today, they'd have Instagram followers, and they'd be on TikTok and everywhere, on Facebook. They'd be huge, and they were sort of like celebrities. And there's a letter I found when I was researching Moonlight during his trial in the Sydney Morning Herald, where this fuddy-duddy eastern suburbs type was written in to complain about the amount of coverage given to the Captain Moonlight court case, because my teenage girls now go and grab the newspaper and devour it before I get a chance to read it before heading into the city for work every morning. And it was that kind of celebrity nature that they had. And I think Moonlight's quite different to that. There's all this mythology around Ned Kelly and essentially become one of the dullest stories, if that was possible, the Kelly story, because it's now so enveloped in myth and legend that it's very hard to actually find the truth. But with Moonlight, I can't claim to have found the truth, but I reckon I got closer to it the more I sort of went through those letters of his and read the accounts of those people who attended his trial and his execution as well.
I'm going to read a quote for you, which is related to another book of yours, which is called Buckley's Chance, about the convict William Buckley. This is what you've said. It's a weird thing, but I become so obsessed with their lives, I often feel as though they're sitting with me, dictating part of the story. In the case of William Buckley, I truly felt as though he was looking over my shoulder as I wrote. Is there something at Alfred Deacon about you?
Yeah, hey, I'm a bit of a realist. I don't subscribe to spiritualism, and I mean, I'd love to. I'm really jealous of people who have that set of beliefs, no matter what it is, that there is something there, because I think it'd be fantastic to adamantly know that you're going someplace really nice, like the Central Coast. You know, but I also I have a view that I just think that what we live in, this extraordinary universe that was created out of what, 13.8 billion years ago, to me that's an incredible enough story to believe in anyway. So no, but there's a sense that you become the character. I mean, I think it's a bit wanky when authors always talk about becoming their character and getting into their minds, and I've always thought, yeah, that's crap. It actually is true. You do that, and you know, my wife said today she had to put up with me for well over a year and a half with Buckley, anguishing, waking up at 3 o'clock in the morning. Because the problem with the Buckley story, I don't know if you know it, just very quickly, he was a huge man for his time, probably 6'6". Although various newspapers back then said he was 7'2", and the whole range. He was a convict, grew up in a very small village in England, sent out here for stealing a small piece of Irish cloth, and cloth back then was worth a lot of money. And they arrived to set up a new penal settlement just down in Sorrento, at the entrance to Port Phillip Bay in Victoria. And he escaped one night, this moonlit night. Fantastic story. Ends up running and walking right around Port Phillip Bay with 4 other convicts. They think they're going to China. His geography wasn't one of their strong points. They end up near Geelong. And this is why I know the story, because I grew up in Wadawurrung territory, their land, and he ended up being taken in by the Wadawurrung, and he lived with them for 32 years. Now that's the longest that anyone from a Western society in history has ever lived with an Indigenous culture. And he didn't really leave us with much, because when he came back, he was found by John Batman. At the time that Batman was just found in Melbourne, Batman was a shocking piece of work. He'd already slaughtered a village of Indigenous people in Tasmania. He'd come to find this new pastoral land, so they were about ready to rape and pillage right across Victoria, this great farming land that they discovered. And so he used Buckley for 2 years as his interpreter to try and get the Kulin Nation of people, which is the 5 Indigenous groups around Port Phillip Bay, to sit down and do a deal with him. And within 3 years, that culture had been so wiped out by the introduction of sugar and disease. And the sheep that they brought over, the sheep with their flat teeth and the way that they grind away, they started eating up all of the yam daisy and a lot of the agriculture that these Aboriginal people had been subsisting on for tens of thousands of years. And so suddenly they became incredibly dependent on these bags of flour and bags of sugar and rum that were being thrown at them all the time. And Buckley became so disenchanted with what he saw happening there, and feared for his own safety too, because the politics was also incredible. Politics everywhere you go. Some of the tribes of the Kulin Nation believed that he was acting too much for these white men, and he got caught in the middle. So he jumped on a ship and went down to Hobart, where he ended up marrying this tiny little Irish woman she just got off a boat. Her husband had been murdered. and he ended up marrying her. And I again go back to that primary source thing that you go down the Tassie archives and you can find his wedding certificate. And they both signed their certificate with crosses, because that's what you did when you were illiterate. You had your own little cross that you did. And you can see where he actually either was trying too hard and he pressed down too hard with the fountain pen and has smudged a little bit on it. So, you know, once again, you're sort of that far away from feeling a part of it. But yeah, he was an extraordinary character, and it's such a sketchy background that doing that book gave him nightmares, because you're trying to do justice to the culture that he came from and the culture that then welcomed him in. The one run took a man who, these white men who arrived were raping and pillaging their country. There was no need for them to welcome him in and become a part of their group. And yet he did that. And probably, we don't know for sure, but we think he sired quite a few children, and some of their descendants, presumably, are among the wondering people now, these days. And to me, that's an incredible story. I mean, we'll never know probably where they are and who they are. He ended up dying a broken man down in Hobart in 1852. He fell from his horse and carriage. But he'd been used by everyone. And he is one of the great, extraordinary characters of Australian history, I think.
Fascinating. We're going to turn to questions in 1 minute. I just want to ask you, Garry, what now? What are you doing now?
I'm trying to do not much at all, actually. But I keep getting, like Michael Corleone in The Godfather, I keep getting pulled back in. I'm doing a column for Australian Community Media at the moment. It's a daily column. I have to do something every day on the election campaign. Yeah, I know it sounds boring, but I'm trying to make it sort of as interesting as possible. So I have to file that. I work Sundays to Thursdays doing 500 or 600 words every day.
And how do you find that?
I'm loving it. I actually love it. I mean, it can be boring, particularly with this current crop of politicians on all sides. But some of the themes that are emerging, and you've got to do your research again. So, yesterday I was digging through some stuff and I came across this story back in 1984 in America, Ronald Reagan at his height, and CBS decided to run a 6-minute news story about the broken promises of Ronald Reagan. And they ran it in the news. Now, a 6-minute news report in a 30-minute bulletin is huge. It's like a long novel. And they read it, and the next day the White House rang them and said, "Thanks very much, that was fantastic." And they said, "Didn't you listen to the story? We were just criticising Reagan right through." And they said, "We don't care about that. No one listens. What you showed was a series of clips for 6 minutes of Ronald Reagan looking presidential, shaking school kids' hands, standing, aristocratically in front of the American flag, proud with his hand on his heart. That's all that matters." And the White House in '84 had discovered the power that the eye beats the ear, that we look but we don't listen. And if you take that theory, which has sort of dominated election campaigns ever since, and apply it to here, all of the stunts that you see with Albanese in his high-vis jacket, or Morrison in a high-vis jacket looking incredible, or a hairdresser's skirt, whatever he's doing, you just see it for what it is these days. And I think at least we've grown up a bit from the 80s. We now recognise a stunt when we see it. And I think because of social media now, we're all communicating with each other so quickly. As soon as Morrison started washing those linens, everyone responded on all social media channels, but just going, yuck. And people, I think we've grown up a little bit more, but we still don't listen. We still look. So, hopefully I can have a bit of fun with that over the coming 6 weeks.
Oh, so when's it going to start?
That's already started. It started 2 weeks ago. It's called The Echidna. So if you want to subscribe, there's a webpage called, I think, theechidna.com.au, and you can just sign up for the newsletter, and I do a whole bunch of jokes and talk about the election campaign. I'm trying to be just different, because I just find most political writing, it just makes you want to go out in the backyard and go and do something else. So I'm trying to sort of liven it up a little bit.
Fantastic. On that note, over to you, Garry, it's all yours. There's a microphone that'll be coming around. Questions? Hands up for a question. 1, 2. Thank you, and at the front.
Thank you, Garry. I think I heard a story, and perhaps you can put me right or even wrong, but I'd heard that some people in Gundagai had somehow or other got the remains of Captain Moonlight and reburied them so that he'd be next to or near.
Yeah, this is
Nesbitt.
that took place in the 1990s. It's true, it took place. He was buried at Rookwood Cemetery, what is now Rookwood Cemetery, that like mini city. If you've ever been through there, it's just an incredible place though. And he had asked to be buried with James Nesbitt, and he'd asked his own lawyer to find the clothes that James had been wearing when he was shot dead so he could wear them as his shroud when he was put in his coffin. And they refused to do that. So they took his body to Rookwood. Nesbitt had been buried in Gundagai, at North Gundagai Cemetery. So in the 90s, when those letters appeared and people began hearing about the story of Captain Moonlight for the first time, a couple of women in Gundagai said, well, why don't we fulfil his final wish and have him buried with James Nesbitt? The problem for that is that Nesbitt was buried in an unmarked grave, which is what they did for criminals back then. So we still don't know where Nesbitt actually is in North Gundagai Cemetery. But these two women lobbied the state government, they lobbied the Anglican Church, and finally got permission, and it's a big process to do. They disinterred his remains and took them down, and then they staged an event where everyone got dressed up in a colonial costume, and they took his remains along, and he's now buried beneath this rock with the words inscribed that he'd asked to have. I can't remember what they were, but beneath this rock was an anti-trial or something like that. And it's quite a moving sort of memorial. And even though you can argue what he did was wrong, and there's still some debate as to whether or not he killed the police officer or if it was a result of friendly fire, we'll never really know. But we do know that his court case was brought about. It was a series of injustices. The judge was a disgrace whose brother had owned the property. You would have thought he would have disqualified himself from the trial. But there was no question at all that he was going to swing. It was just a question of how long it would take. But he made some incredible speeches, particularly after he'd been found guilty. He made this marvellous speech, which is in the book, where he talks about the inequities in the system. And kind of like Deeming made a speech as well. And he'd been found guilty as well, but his wasn't as profound. You know, people doing it. So that was the difference.
There's a question at the back, thank you.
Yes, my question, I grew up with being told I had Buckley's chance about many things, which I often interpreted as meaning no chance, but obviously Buckley did have some chances. My question was more about Deeming, and in retrospect, having spent time with his story, do you think he had schizophrenia? Do you think he had a head injury? Or do you think he was a fantasist like, Netflix is portraying at the moment?
Yeah, kind of like that Bad Vegan show. I don't know if anyone's seen that, where that woman gets taken in by the guy who promises to make her immortal. I think it's probably a combination. There's no doubt he had a mental illness, that he would have had some form of schizophrenia. He had bouts where he would collapse and then have a series of epileptic fits. Now, he'd been jailed in Darlinghurst Jail actually in the start of the 1880s when he came out here for a very short time working as a plumber. And there was a series of epileptic fits there that they were convinced were authentic. He then tried the same thing over in Hull prison. And the governor of Hull Jail was a much more cynical old fellow who said, nah, this is the old ball of soap routine, where prisoners would stuff all the soap in their mouth to make them froth going and pretend they were having an epileptic fit. So they could then be transferred to the prison hospital, where the food was fantastic, the care was much higher, there were warm blankets, and he had a much better chance of escape. And so they did a search of his cell, and they did discover small balls of soap that he'd taken from the wash area and was using them. But he also had periods where he just blacked out. And I think that he clearly had issues with epilepsy. There's no doubt about that. And I think he also, he would have been seen to by proper doctors now and been analysed by an array of psychologists. But back then, as I said, they were too busy reading the bumps in your head and whether or not one eyebrow was higher than the other. So, it's hard to say, but I think for sure, there was an issue there.
One, maybe two questions. One here in the middle.
Hi, thank you very much. I'm going to out myself as a high school teacher, and I just wanted to ask you this question. You hinted a little bit at humanising criminals in creating, which could create a romanticising of a story, I think, and out of the current culture of celebrity madness, which I think we're seeing. I'm just wondering how we can use great stories like what you're creating here and real truths while teaching these texts to students, so that they, but also countering that, developing that critical lens that we need, so that people don't just believe the images.
Yeah, I'm glad you added yourself as a teacher and a history teacher. English and right? Because when I was going to high school in the 70s, I found history the toughest class to sit through. It was incredibly dull the way it was taught. I reckon for most of you, that whole white Australia kind of it all began when Cook sailed up the coast, and from there with Governor Phillip. And it was just incredibly dull. And I think we've always undervalued our history in this country. And two of my best mates turned Chopper Read into one of the biggest gangster figures in this country. They ghosted his books for him, John Sylvester and Andy Rule. They're good mates all the way from newspapers. And you can argue about the glamorisation that we're seeing of, it's the Kardashian thing. It's all caught up in that whole Instagram, Twitter, kind of TikTok society that we've become. But I think these are the sort of stories that I'm writing, the sort of stories I wish I had known about. Man, I grew up in Geelong. I went to North Geelong High School. No one ever taught me about William Buckley, and yet he'd been on Wadawurrung land for 32 years. And through him, you can tell the story of the settling of Australia and the divisions between white and black Australia and all of those issues that we're now grappling with. You can tell that story through that. You can tell later on, you can tell the story through Captain Moonlight. You can talk about how you identify as a person. You can talk about colonial Australia, which wasn't as boring and as dull as we think. There are some incredible characters out there. So I'd like to think that we can take those sort of stories, and Deeming too. I mean, I'm the last person to have tried to glamorise Frederick Deeming. I mean, I've been pretty honest. I think the passage I read tells you a lot about how I thought about it. I didn't like him. I found him distasteful, and that's why I had to find a hero for my book, because I'd had my hero in William Buckley, and I'd had kind of a hero in Moonlight, but I couldn't do that with Deeming. He was just, he killed children, he'd slash their throats. How do you do that? Killed his wives, and may have been Jack the Ripper. But so I had to find someone else to tell a story. But in doing so, the more you look, the more you find what a rich kind of history we had, not just since white settlement, but going back over those 60 or 70,000 years. And we've seen the turning of the tide, I think, in the last 10 years, with a lot of books coming up now and that have been placed on the curriculum. I just wish I could go back to high school now and take those history classes now compared to what they were like back in the 1970s.
I think there's one more question. I'm just going to check with Jackie. Are we okay to take another question?
Absolutely, yep.
Just at the back there.
Just quickly, talking about how you find these things, how did the letters of Captain Moonlight come to light in 1990?
Yeah, they were found by an academic researcher called Garry Linnell, who has written a lot about the gay history of Australia. He was told about them, went through them all, and then wrote a very short piece in a journal, an academic journal, talking about how he believed Moonlight was gay. And I went and had a couple of long chats to Garry when I was researching the book, just so I could actually get use him as a guide, almost. Because I'm not an academic, I have no academic training, I'm just a journo. And so the letters themselves, once they were discovered, they were found in a tin box in these archives. And they'd just been sitting there gathering dust for 110, 120 years. And he'd been writing these letters by candlelight every night in his death cell and sending them out to family, to friends who had helped him over the years. Dozens and dozens of letters. not realising that they'd been seized by the jail authorities and kept. They were never actually sent. You know, there's a letter to James Nesbitt's mother saying, you know, I loved your son like I would my own mother and sisters and brother. He was incredibly close to me. Now that he's gone, I don't feel like living. And incredibly touching. And, you know, Andrew George Scott, who was Captain Moonlight, he was taught all of the classics. You know, he went to a very good school. He had private tutors. He could quote slabs of the great poems to you. And you know, this isn't a day and an age when men would write each other letters, and they would often sign the letter "Lots of love, Garry," you know, or "You have a fond place in my heart." It wasn't interpreted as being in any way romantic or gay, but the amount of material that he wrote about James Nesbitt and his relationship with him. And I'm not just the only one, yeah, Gary Wotherspoon has come to the same conclusion, that those two were soulmates. They were incredibly close. And after Nesbitt was killed, Scott blamed himself. He blamed the Wallopers as well for, you know, shooting him. But he saw no point in going on in life. And he held to those old chivalrous ideas of the 1850s and 60s, which he'd been raised on, that a man should have honour, that a man should have dignity, and he should be trusted at his word. And when you read through these letters, I've actually loaned them out to the guy who's writing the screenplay for the TV series. And he rang me the other week and just said, these are phenomenal. You know, the little details in there, the pause, the punctuation is incredible. The standard of the handwriting. And let's face it, none of us have good handwriting these days, do we? We're fantastic at writing text messages with our thumbs, but you know, it's very hard. I find that my handwriting has deteriorated. Sorry, I'm offline, but my handwriting has deteriorated shockingly over the last 10 or 15 years. I can't read my own notes barely anymore.
Can I just say, Garry, you're going to have to handwrite a bit because you're going to be signing books up the back. Gary's books is a sale, so I know it's lunchtime, but please join us quickly. Say hi to Garry and to sign his books.
Thank you very much for having me.